And the 60s was something else. The 60s as an era, there's changes occurring, not just in Philadelphia, but across the nation, across the world. This is an era of what? Explosion, an era of change. This was an era of color, an era of music. This is an era of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. This was an era of black power. This was an era of Vietnam, and we saw the war in Vietnam every day on television. This was an era of a cultural change in music, because Bob Dylan and all these brothers started coming out with lyrics that spoke about the social issues in the world. This is an era when young African American and Hispanic students were coming back into our community from universities. And this is the first time we ever had a chance to sit down at their feet and listen to the truth of history. Prior to this, now of course, all of you have been in situations where there have been black studies. Am I correct? African American studies or those kinds of things. That did not exist when I grew up. There's no such thing. African American studies, black studies, we weren't even called black people then. We were still Negroes or colored. But again, I say this was an era of change and so much was happening.
What was happening in your community then?
These young brothers and sisters that were coming back into our community with history, with politics, with economics, with geography, and that were telling us that we come from a line of great people, because we didn't believe this prior to this, and that we cannot accept just anything that anyone tells us, politicians, the power structure, powers that be, that we have a stake in our community. And we began listening to this. Our mothers and fathers, of course, were appalled, or they were scared to death. They had good reason to be. We were young.
What were they afraid of?
What was to come? What was to come? I mean, our families had been here for almost 400 years, and they knew what cause and effect is. They knew what to expect. When you take a particular point, a position against authority, they knew what to expect. They were afraid for us.
So can you just say what was a key idea that would make them feel like that
Well,
would be
we
their
were
fear?
talking about being responsible in our own communities. We were talking about holding police officers, like the ones that stole my money, and politicians and council people and legislators. We talk about holding them accountable. And this had not happened in the history of my folk here in this country. And so you're going to generate anger on one side, you're going to generate fear, and you're going to generate a feeling of being so powerful that nothing stopped you. And that's what we felt as kids. We felt so powerful.
Picturing you in the midst of this swirl of things that's happening, and you do what at this time?
Well,
What are some of the things you do?
Well, we joined organizations in our communities that were initially set up as co-ops, as organizations that would patrol our own neighborhoods, that would help the old folk, that would do co-op programs that would enable people of low income to just buy food, fresh food, good food. We had educational programs set up in our communities that taught our children history, as we hadn't been taught.
You were joining organizations, helping people in your neighborhood. Did that change how people were seeing you at that time?
Oh, it did. It did, because for one reason, Philadelphia was also a city of gangs. It was a city of neighborhoods, for one thing, and every neighborhood had a corner, and a corner being, quote, a euphemism for gangs. And so Philadelphia was a neighborhood of gangs. Some of these neighborhoods I had never been in. Even if they were 3 or 4 or 5 blocks away from me, I had never been in their neighborhood. Not unless I had my gang with me, because we had to fight. And this was prior to the era of guns. Say, oh, the proliferation of guns today, but that's another matter. So we fought, as I said, Philadelphia being a prize-fighting town, we fought with our hands. Everyone knew how to fight, knew how to box, and you would always ask for what was called a fair one, which would mean you and him get out there in the middle and get in the circle and slug it out. So when this new change, when this new era, this era of change started happening, we began being taught that that member of that gang, those group of guys 4 or 5 or 6 blocks away from you, who you have been fighting for the last 5 years of your life, are your brothers. I said, whoa, what do you mean? He says, in the same situation you're in, economically, politically, socially, they are as disenfranchised as you, they are just as oppressed as you, and there's a bigger force that's doing it to all of y'all. So, join hands with your brother, and that's what we set out to do. And it's the first time in my life I was able to go into neighborhoods I had never been in before and sit down with these brothers, and we began to organize. You're talking about Black Lives Matter today, something on the same line, BLA, Black Liberation Army, Revolutionary Action Movement. This was even before the Panthers. But we started organizing in our communities to protect ourselves, to train ourselves, to educate ourselves.
So where does it go wrong?
Well, cause and effect. While we're doing this, there is an entity watching this saying, oh, no. What's going on? What are those? Again, this is part of the story, part of my history. But what are those niggas doing? What are those spics doing? We can't have that. And that's where Police Commissioner Frank L. Rizzo, who was about 6'3", 6'4", 300-pound, tough guy, Italian boy. And he rose in the ranks. He was what they call a head basher, a head banger. He rose in the ranks of the Philadelphia Police until he became the police commissioner. And he was commissioner with the same kind of attitude. How we approach what's happening in the inner city is we crush them. And that's what they set out to do. Not only that, there was a new element that began to appear in my community that I had never seen before. Drugs. There were no drugs in my community. There were no drugs anywhere in Philadelphia that we knew. Not illicit drugs, of course, aspirin and there was no heroin, there was no cocaine, there was no methamphetamine, there was none of that. That explosion occurred in this same era. And a lot of people who are historians today or sociologists today look back and say that was planned and orchestrated. Because one day it wasn't there and the next day it was everywhere. Now remember, we're young folk, we're being led by some older folk, and we're organizing. We're trying to do things in our community that we felt would uplift our community and benefit everybody that lived there.
So at this point, you're not the bad boy anymore.
Oh,
you are like
no.
You're volunteering, you're helping, you're organizing. So you're not going to school, or are you?
No.
Okay, but you're involved.
School was in the community. School was no longer at the junior high school that I was supposed to go to.
Right.
Or the high school that I had never went to.
Okay.
And
but now you have a purpose. You're doing this.
Oh, yes. And we're learning things, and we're implementing ideas and projects, and we're doing this 1 minute. The next minute, there's dope everywhere. With drugs comes money, and with money comes distractions, and people started making decisions based on materialism. So the movement was crushed by that. It was crushed by the power of the authorities, the paramilitary police, and it was also crushed by thousands of young men like me that started going to prison. I don't mean juvenile institution, I mean prison.
How did all of those things funnel into your life, the life of Irvin Moore, going from doing all this work to what? What happens next?
You know, if I didn't know better, I would say that God somehow singled me out, to bear the brunt of all of that, because all of the reactionary forces that came into our community, community, seemed to follow me about, seemed to pick me up, seemed to bash me in the head, seemed to lock me up, seemed to send me to prison, I'm saying, wait a minute, what is this? But of course, that's not real. That was happening all over to everyone. And I started going to jail. I started using drugs.
If you look back, what was like the first step you took toward the life that got you into the system?
Again, I was what was called a young revolutionary in my community. I wanted to do what I felt was right to protect and defend and uphold and uplift my community. Whoever lived there, white, black, Hispanic, it made no difference. You lived in that community, we wanted to do something good for you. We wanted to protect you. And the reaction that we got from the powers that be, we didn't expect. We did not expect that the police would come down on us the way they did. We didn't expect that they would begin to create laws that would impact people in my community. Prior to that, I know a lot of you have heard of people like Al Capone and Pretty Boy, Babyface Nelson, and Frank Nitti, and Public Enemy #1, and the mob boys from the 1920s and 30s and 40s. None of them ever served or received the kind of sentences that a young 18-year-old boy would receive today. None of them. Those kinds of draconian laws did not even exist. You have children today, 18 years old, 19 years old, 20 years old, they're children. They're serving 40, 60, 80, 100 years. Or, as Sam said initially, in Pennsylvania, a life sentence. You've all heard of someone standing in front of the judge says, I sentence you to a life sentence, and he's 15 years to life or 25 years to life or 30. In Pennsylvania, life is life and has always been life. They don't have to say without parole. If you're sentenced to life, you're sentenced to die in prison.